I'm Prasanta Kr. I'm a professor of English, and today I'm going to talk to you on reading text and subalternity. My target audience would be students from social sciences, and there's a reason for this. I was recently asked to talk to some students of the social sciences at a research workshop. And my problem was that in my subject, we don't have field work, for instance. We do not do statistical analysis as you do in some of the social sciences, so there was no software that I could talk about. So eventually I ended up by talking to them about reading, because that is what we do in departments of English. Most of all, I think we teach students how to read. And reading is something that anyone who's engaged in research would have to do. I'm not talking about straightforward reading that all of us can do, but the different way of reading, which I will talk about now. So that is my topic. The other point is about, I should talk about subalternity. Now, subalternity is a relational term, it's a flexible term. And it is Gayatri Spivak who sort of popularized this topic, this term. And it refers to the powerless. I mean, the term has a military origin. In the army, you have the officers, and then you have the other ranks. And these other ranks are the subaltern. But I think subaltern makes a lot of sense in our Indian context. A lot of social science research and even literature in my own area is concerned with subalternity and giving voice to the subalterns. So from that angle, mostly, I'll be looking at how to read. Now, reading is not as simple as we think it is. All of us read. In fact, it would be difficult to go through life without reading. We don't do that. We are constantly reading, say, our friends' face for clues, our parents' face for clues. When the teacher enters a class, we look at his or her face to find out whether he or she is in a good mood or not. Reading intensifies, especially when we fall in love. We're always interpreting the beloved's gestures and tone of voice. So reading is basically interpretation. But as I said, it's not as simple and straightforward as that. This simple optical illusion that you see is a good illustration. It's an extreme case, but it illustrates my point. Some of you would see this as a duck, and some would see it as a rabbit. Now, if you take this image as a text, clearly there are two ways of looking at it. There are other things like there are certain limitations, bodily limitations that dictate or control how we look at things, but I'm not concerned with that. What I'm saying is simple enough, I suppose. It's about perception. So this could be a duck or it could be a rabbit. It's a harmless example, but not so harmless if you think about it in a different context. What about the disputed structure in Ayodhya? Is that a temple or is that a mosque? Now, in this case, it doesn't really matter whether it's a duck or a rabbit, but in that context, is it a temple or is it a mosque? There are very serious implications of how you read. All right, let's move on. Now, here is a simple poem. Control, Alt, Right, Delete by Brian Bilston. Brian Bilston is a name that you may be familiar with. He's called the Poet Laureate of Twitter, and his very interesting poems often you come across on Twitter. Now, here is a poem. Let's read this. Control, Alt, Right, Delete by Brian Bilston. The world lurches, a violent shift, the return of Nazis to our streets. But do not let it get you. Press, Control, Alt, Delete. Fascism should serve no function. It's an ugly backspace into history. We must be greater than the hatred. To escape, we have the key. Keep tabs upon intolerance. Send racism into retreat. To end hate, we need to insert love and press Control, Alt, Delete. Now, here is a simple poem, as I said, and you can see that this poem generates meaning through the use of keyboard commands. So when you read this poem, you know that you have to do that work, that kind of interpretation, that kind of thinking you have to do. It's a simple poem, doesn't really tax you, but it shows you that you have to do a certain amount of interpretive labor. There is a certain amount of work involved in reading the poem. And as I said, this poem does not really demand great work, but there are texts that actually require you to do that place a huge interpretive burden on you. James Joyce's Ulysses is a good example. T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland, is another example that comes to mind. Now, the theories that I'm talking about, the theory of reading or the theories of reading that I'm talking about are of Western origin. So there is a point that we should get out of the way. It's Western, so what application does it have to our Indian context? And I think the best person to answer that would be Gandhi. When Gandhi wrote his autobiography, The Story of My Experiments with Truth, one of his friends, he mentions this in the preface, one of his friends asked him that, Gandhi, what are you doing? You are a champion of Indian values, and here you are attempting a Western genre. And Gandhi's answer was that there's nothing wrong with that. His friend's objection was that Western autobiography is egotistical, and in the Indian tradition there is a effacing of the self. And Gandhi said, no, what I'll do is I will change Western autobiography somewhat. It will not be about myself, it will be more about my soul. And this we call appropriation. So Gandhi appropriated Western autobiography to serve his own ends, and we will be doing that with theories that are of Western origin, French, or they could be from France, from Derrida, mostly Derrida and others have had a great influence on the way we read now. Now, deconstruction. Here is a definition offered by, not Derrida, but by a younger colleague of his at Yale, Barbara Johnson. This was way back in 1975, and in an essay, Barth/Balzac, this is what she said. Deconstruction is not synonymous with deconstruction. It is in fact much closer to the original meaning of the word analysis, which etymologically means to undo, a virtual synonym for to deconstruct. The deconstruction of a text does not proceed from random doubt or arbitrary subversion, but by a careful teasing out of warring forces of signification within the text itself. If anything is destroyed in a deconstructive reading, it is not the text, but the claim to unequivocal domination of one mode of signifying over another. A deconstructive reading is a reading that analyzes the specificity of a text's critical difference from itself. There was another definition that she offered, somewhat similar. This was in an essay called Teaching Deconstructively, 1985. Deconstruction is not a form of textual vandalism or generalized skepticism designed to prove that meaning is impossible. Rather, it is the careful teasing out of the conflicting forces of signification that are at work within the text itself. If anything is destroyed in a deconstructive reading, it is not meaning per se, but the claim to unequivocal domination of one mode of signifying over another. Now here in these definitions, the text is visualized as let's say a piece of fabric, a handkerchief, say, where you have the crisscrossing lines, the threads, and what you have then is what they call an aporia. There may be a tangle, an imperfection somewhere, and that is your entry point into the text. But more importantly, deconstruction here is imagined as a responsible act. A text has very many meanings or several meanings. There is a particular meaning that dominates, the imperialistic kind of a meaning. And it is our job as critics reading from a subaltern perspective to deconstruct the text to release all those other meanings that are possible and which are being suppressed. So deconstruction obviously is of great importance to those of us who consider ourselves post-colonial readers. It's important if you are, say, reading from a feminine perspective, and generally if you are interested in revealing, or if you are reading from the point of view of the subaltern. As I said then, a moral act, not an irresponsible act, as she says. It is not generalized skepticism, and it is not vandalism. Also, it's important to stress that it is not something imported from outside. In a sense, the meaning that you are interested in liberating is actually in the text. It is already there in the text. Here is an additional definition offered by another deconstructionist, not so much read now, but he was very well known in those years, Paul Deman. And it's a useful reading because, as I said, it emphasizes that the reading, whatever reading you see, is actually already there in the text. It's implicit in the text. What you are doing, what you have done is you have made it explicit. So here's what he says. The reading is not our reading, since it uses the linguistic elements provided by the text. The distinction between the author and the reader is one of the false distinctions that the deconstruction makes evident. The deconstruction is not something we have added to the text, but it constituted the text in the first place. A literary text simultaneously asserts and denies the authority of its own rhetorical mode, and by reading the text as we did, we are only trying to come closer to being as rigorous a reader as the author had to be in order to write the sentence in the first place. Poetic reading is the most advanced and refined form of deconstruction. It may differ from critical or discursive writing in the economy of its articulation, but not in kind. So, as I said, he emphasizes that the meaning is actually already present there. And here you may like to think about a Shakespeare text. When Dr. Johnson, the famous critic, read Shakespeare, he saw certain things there. Today we would read from a gender perspective. Today Shylock, you would read in the context of what is happening in Europe vis-a-vis migrants, or even nearer home, what is happening in, say, in Burma or in Assam. So how you look at a text and the meaning you find, the Shakespeare text then already actually holds all those meanings that we see in it. What Dr. Johnson saw in that text was there, and what we see in it is actually already there. And here is a major turn, as you probably know, that has occurred in the social sciences and in knowledge generally. Post-structuralists tend to see all knowledge, history, anthropology, literature, psychology, etc., as textual. This means that knowledge is not composed of just concepts, but of words. So all the more important how we read. History for long we have thought as rather objective. The scrupulous historian pays attention to certain sources which are reliable. He screens out the irreliable, and so history has had some kind of a claim to objectivity. Even that has been questioned, and we look at history rather differently now. Hayden White's famous book, Meta History, saw the historical work as a verbal structure in the form of a narrative prose discourse that classifies past structures and processes in order to explain what they were by representing them as models. And a historian, when he's looking at the past, makes a certain selection, he rearranges certain events, or he gives emphasis to certain events, others he doesn't consider so important. All of that is actually a kind of choice that he's making. So as he says here, the next point, a historian doesn't just find history, but also makes it by arranging events in a certain order, answering questions, what happened, when, how, why, deciding which events in the chronicle to include and exclude, stressing some events and subordinating others. And Hayden then makes the point that we should read history rather the way we read literary texts. Now, here is a very well-known poem, and I just want to show you that meanings are not guaranteed. Here is a poem that shows you how complex reading can be. The Road Not Taken, one of the best-known poems that you can have, by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair and having perhaps the better claim. Because it was grassy and wanted wear, though as for that the passing there had hardly warned them really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, this poem is often read as a poem in which the poet had a choice of travelling by taking two roads, and he chose, as he says in the second last line, the one less travelled by. And because he did that, it's probably in a better place now. But then, if you look at it closely, a little closer, the meaning is by no means final. That meaning is by no means final. For instance, he says like two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood. Now, obviously, he had to make a choice. He says it was not possible for him to take both roads, so he had to choose one. And he stood there wondering which one to take, and then he took one of the two roads. Now, we sometimes think, or the last stanza probably encourages us to think that he took the more difficult path. But if you look at the second stanza, he says that both were about the same. Each was grassy, and each almost as fair. So no real difference as such. Also, the fact that he says roads rather than paths is significant. Road would imply the certain amount of traffic. It's different from the idea of a path. So it's not as if these were paths not often travelled or in the wilderness. Road. And then in the third stanza, he says that again the difference between the two roads is much slighter than we may think it is, because both equally lay, and then he decides to take one and come back, but he knows that he can't actually do that, and his choice is going to be final. The fourth stanza, the word sigh, as if there is a certain amount of sadness or regret. So has he made the better choice? He asserts it has made all the difference, but we wonder. So the more you look at this poem, the less clear it is. I have another poem, but before I go there, what I want to stress is that meaning would be generated by the reader. In the poem that we read just now, Frost's poem, you would want to give it a meaning, and the meaning, as you see, the poem can be quite equivocal. So the meaning then would come from the reader. The reader could decide, no, it's a poem that talks about the importance of taking the less traveled road, or it could be a poem which says that no, it's not that clear. And even that could be the conclusion drawn by the reader. But very much the ending, the closure as we say, is supplied by the reader. So the reader is really is a participant in creating meaning. Now here is another poem, and by now I think many of us, especially in literature classes of course, we know that we should not only be looking at what is present but also at what is absent. And here is a good poem, again a very famous poem by Wordsworth, probably one of the best known poems that you can have. Let's see. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high over vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils. Beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze, continuous as the stars that shine and twinkle on the Milky Way, they stretched in never-ending line along the margin of a bay. 10,000 saw I at a glance, tossing their heads in sprightly dance. The leaves beside them danced, but they updid the sparkling waves in glee. A poet could not but be gay in such jocund company. I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. For oft when on my couch I lie, in vacant or in pensive mood, they flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. And then my heart with pleasure fills and dances with the daffodils. So it's a romantic poem, a well-known romantic poem. But usually in my literature classes, by now our students know, or they have been trained in a certain way of reading. And so what they would notice is, and I can imagine even an average student telling me this, that first thing is there is another person here to whom he doesn't refer to at all. And that person, of course, is his Wordsworth's sister, William Wordsworth's sister, Dorothy. He himself said that he looked at the world through her eyes. And some of these lines are to be found in Dorothy's journal, quite close. So there is no acknowledgement or no reference to that. The other thing is that it seems to be a poem coming from an era that was before industrialism. Here is a poem that is written when the Industrial Revolution is in full flow, and but the poem actually refers to an earlier, or seems to refer to an earlier era. So these are things, and there may be a political choice made there. And as I said, these are things that students from literature classes, they know to look at, they pick out these things. Now, from my own research, I happen to be working on some missionaries, and in Assam, where I live, the missionaries were the first to produce a dictionary, as in other parts of India, many other parts of India. And here is an extract from a letter that a missionary's wife wrote. The missionary here is Miles Bronson, and this is written by Mrs. Bronson. And this is a letter that she writes home. And I'm offering you this letter, and I'm asking you then to notice what is implicit or not stressed so much, or even hidden. So here's the letter. Miles Bronson actually brought out a dictionary. This was in 1867, and this letter it dates from that period, 1867. It describes the missionary hard at work on his dictionary, the Assamese dictionary. Could you visit your old home today, you would find your room occupied by Papa as a study, where he is working hard all day on the dictionary. You would see in the center a long table covered with green baize, on which are piled at long intervals large books and writing materials in orderly confusion. You would see Papa sitting at one end of the table, and on the other side 3 dusky pandits assisting him in his slow work. You would see Mama's rattan work basket standing close by Papa's chair, where I sit near, ready to render him any assistance in my power, such as looking up references, synonyms, and definitions. I cannot give him my time as fully, I cannot give my time as fully to assisting Papa as I did in Sibsagar, where I had no household cares to interrupt. Here I have school duties, housekeeping cares, and 1,000 little things to attend to. I have aided him in the revision of the manuscript, which is now ready for the press. So in the workshop that I referred to in the beginning of this talk, as I said, they're mostly students from the social sciences. I said, what do you notice? And they were by then oriented to sort of answer this question, and they said, first of all, the dusky pundits. Obviously, the dictionary was not a one-man's work, and there were several other native informants who helped him to bring out the dictionary, and there's just a slight reference. We don't even know the names. So that's one thing that they pointed out. The other is the woman's contribution, Mrs. Miles Bronson's contribution, active participation in bringing out this dictionary, which is sort of glossed over. So then here is what you might consider a historical letter. And let me tell you that most historians would actually ignore this letter, as of secondary importance. But for us in literature, this is precisely the kind of thing that we are interested in. And as I said, when you read this letter, you realize or you look at things that are not said. And I suggest then, at the end of my talk, that in the social sciences also, you have a situation like that. You've done your field work, you've collected your research material, you're sitting down to write your thesis. And that process requires reading of the kind that I've indicated. And so eventually your work is, in a sense, poetic. There are certain choices that you're making, certain things that you're emphasizing, you're interpreting. I can even imagine two persons working in the same area, doing almost the same field work and coming out with quite different interpretations. And so I hope I have been able to suggest how important reading is to research, even in the social sciences. And so I'd like to leave you with the point that we should read for ourselves, and reading is an active part of the research that we do. Thank you.